The moment William Carter saw his daughter on the security feed at 2:13 a.m., walking hand in hand with the maid he had secretly been following, his entire world stopped making sense. For a full 3 seconds, he didn't breathe. The billionaire sat frozen in his dark office, the glow of 10 monitors reflecting in his widened eyes, as if the house he built to protect his family had just betrayed him from the inside out. His daughter Emily was not supposed to be awake. She hadn't spoken a full sentence in almost 2 years, not since the night her mother died in a sudden accident that no one in the family ever fully explained to her. Doctors called it trauma. Therapists called it emotional shutdown. William called it survival. But survival didn't look like this. On the screen, Emily was walking. Slowly, carefully, but walking. And beside her was Grace Williams, the old maid who had worked in the Carter household longer than almost anyone else. A woman who barely spoke above a whisper, a woman William had never truly noticed until strange things started happening in his house. Small things at first. A toy moved from one room to another. A light turned on in a hallway no one used. Emily smiling faintly when Grace entered the room, then going silent again the moment she left. William told himself it was coincidence. Stress. Grief playing tricks on a broken child's mind. But then came the nights. Every night at exactly 9:47 p.m., Grace would leave the mansion carrying 2 black bags. Not large enough to draw attention, but always heavy enough to slow her steps. And every night she returned before sunrise, quiet, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Tonight, William decided he would finally understand the truth. He followed her from a distance, careful not to be seen, his expensive coat blending into the shadows of the empty street as she walked farther than she had ever gone before. 12 blocks. 15. Into parts of the city even his own security maps labeled as inactive zones. His instincts screamed at him to stop, but something deeper pushed him forward. Then he saw her stop in front of an old building, one he didn't recognize. No signage, no lights, just a broken door that opened from the inside the moment she knocked. William moved closer, just enough to see inside. And what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Children. Not 1 or 2. Many. Sitting, eating, resting, being held like they mattered. And Grace was not just visiting. She was moving through them like someone who belonged there, like someone they trusted more than the world outside. William's mind raced. This wasn't possible. Grace was his maid. She belonged in his house, not here in a place he had never authorized, never even known existed. And then, as if the night itself was watching him, Grace suddenly paused. Slowly, she turned her head toward the doorway. Toward him. Even from the shadows, William felt it. She knew he was there. But instead of fear or surprise, her expression was calm, almost expected. And before William could step back, before he could decide whether to run or reveal himself, a child's voice echoed softly from inside the building, saying something that froze him completely in place. A name. His daughter's name. And Grace whispered back, as if answering a question he was never supposed to hear. She's closer than you think. But how could that be, if Emily was still inside the mansion asleep? William Carter did not sleep that night. He sat in his office long after the screens dimmed, replaying the moment over and over again. That single frozen second when his daughter's name echoed from a place she was never supposed to be. Outside his glass walls, the city of Chicago moved like nothing had changed, but inside him, something had cracked open that he could not close again. By sunrise, he had already ordered a full internal audit of every security camera, every access log, every employee movement in the mansion. He told himself it was control, but deep down, it was fear. Fear that something had been happening inside his home without him seeing it. Fear that he had already lost his daughter in ways he did not understand. Emily Carter's room looked exactly the same when he finally went upstairs. The pale curtains, the untouched toys, the small bed positioned against the wall like it was waiting for someone who no longer belonged in it. But Emily was not there. She had not been there all night, according to the hallway sensors. The system showed 0 movement from her room after midnight. William stood in the doorway longer than he should have, his mind refusing to accept what the data was telling him. Then he saw something on the floor near her bed, a small folded piece of paper. No handwriting he recognized, just a drawing. 2 figures holding hands. One labeled Grace, the other labeled me. His throat tightened, because Emily had not drawn anything in over a year. Downstairs, Grace Williams was already working. Quiet. Controlled. The same way she always moved through the house. As if she belonged to the silence itself. William watched her from the staircase, unseen, studying her like a stranger for the first time in his life. She was not behaving like someone hiding something. That was what disturbed him most. People who hide secrets usually show tension, fear, avoidance. But Grace showed none of it. Only calm. As if whatever she was doing existed outside of his understanding of the house entirely. When she finally noticed him, she did not flinch. She simply nodded once, polite and composed, and continued preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened the night before. That should have reassured him. It did the opposite. A few hours later, William called Dr. Ethan Moore, the child psychologist who had been tracking Emily's condition for months. He kept his voice steady, professional, detached. He asked a simple question. Is it possible for a child suffering from emotional trauma to selectively speak in environments they perceive as safe, but remain silent everywhere else? There was a pause on the line before the doctor answered carefully. In rare cases, yes. Trust triggers can override withdrawal patterns, but only in environments where the child feels completely secure. William looked toward the kitchen where Grace was now humming softly while cleaning. Secure. That word did not belong in his house. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, William reviewed the system logs again, this time more carefully. That was when he saw the second inconsistency. Emily's room had shown no movement, but the hallway outside it had recorded footsteps at 2:11 a.m. Small ones, light ones, and they did not go toward the exit. They moved inward, toward a section of the mansion William had never used. A wing that had been closed since his wife's passing. A wing no employee was supposed to access. William leaned closer to the screen, his pulse tightening, because the footage showed something else now. A second set of access codes had been used that night. Codes that only one person in the house still had clearance for. Grace Williams. And the timestamp matched exactly the moment Emily's voice had been heard in the abandoned building. But that was impossible. Because Grace was inside the mansion at that time, wasn't she? Then William noticed something else buried in the system logs. A single override entry he did not remember authorizing. A remote door unlock, initiated from inside Emily's room. That night, William Carter stopped trusting his own systems. Every log, every timestamp, every motion alert now felt like something carefully arranged rather than something recorded. He sat alone in the darkened control room, staring at frozen frames of his own home, as if the house itself had begun to rewrite its own history. What disturbed him most was not what he had seen, but what he could no longer explain. Emily Carter had always been predictable in her silence. For almost 2 years, she had followed the same patterns, the same rooms, the same distance from the world. But now, according to the system, she was moving in ways she never had before. Not randomly, not chaotically, purposefully, and always when Grace Williams was nearby. The next morning, William tried something different. He did not announce himself. He simply walked the house, slowly, watching. Emily was sitting in the breakfast room when he passed by. She did not look at him, did not react. Her eyes were fixed on the table, but her fingers were gently tracing something on the wood surface, as if following an invisible pattern only she could see. Grace was in the room as well, quietly arranging fruit on a plate. When William stepped closer, Emily stopped moving immediately. The moment he entered, the air changed. Not dramatically, subtly, like a door had closed inside her. Grace noticed it too. She lowered her head slightly, respectful, but there was something in her expression William could not ignore. Awareness. Not fear. Not surprise. Awareness, as if she understood exactly what he was trying to find without him saying a word. That afternoon, William requested Dr. Ethan Moore to return for an unscheduled evaluation. He wanted answers, not theories. He described the behavioral shifts, the nighttime movement, the selective communication. The doctor listened carefully, then chose his words with caution. He explained that trauma responses in children are not linear. That trust-based triggers can create behaviors that appear inconsistent from the outside. But when William mentioned Grace, the doctor paused longer than before. He asked a question William did not expect. Has the child shown this level of responsiveness with anyone else in the household? William hesitated. The answer was no. Only Grace. Dr. Moore wrote something down, then spoke more slowly. Sometimes, he said, children do not respond to authority or logic. They respond to emotional memory. William left the consultation without clarity, only discomfort, because emotional memory meant something had already been built between his daughter and someone else, something he was not part of. Later that evening, William reviewed a different set of recordings, older ones, months before the current pattern began. He was searching for anything connected to Grace. What he found instead was Emily, sitting alone in a hallway, long before Grace had become part of her routine. She was crying silently, not loudly, not dramatically, just small, broken moments of distress that no one had responded to. The timestamp showed it lasted 17 minutes. No staff entered. No one checked on her. And then, just before she stopped crying, the frame briefly flickered. When it returned, Grace was standing at the far end of the hallway. Not walking in. Not arriving. Just there. William replayed it again. And again. There was no recorded entry for her at that time. No door sensor activation. No movement logs. Nothing. As if she had appeared inside the house without being admitted. That was the moment William felt it shift. This was no longer about his daughter's behavior. It was about something in his house that the system itself refused to fully record. And the deeper he searched, the more one question began to form in his mind, heavy and impossible to ignore. If Grace had been present in Emily's most vulnerable moment, and if no one had seen her enter, then how many other moments had already happened inside his home that he was never meant to witness? For the first time since Emily Carter stopped speaking to him, William noticed something he had never allowed himself to see before. The way she looked at Grace Williams, as if the world finally made sense only when the maid was near. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. It was subtle in the way a locked door slowly learns to open again. That morning, William did not announce his presence. He simply watched from the edge of the hallway as Grace entered Emily's room with a small tray of food, moving quietly, carefully, as if every sound mattered. Emily was sitting by the window, knees pulled close to her chest, her eyes distant. The same distance William had seen for years. But the moment Grace stepped inside, something shifted. Not fully, not suddenly, but enough for William to notice. Emily's shoulders loosened slightly. Her gaze lifted just a fraction, as if recognizing something familiar in a world she no longer trusted. Grace did not speak immediately. She placed the tray on the table and sat on the floor instead of the chair, lowering herself to Emily's level without forcing anything. The silence in the room was not empty. It was waiting. After a long moment, Grace spoke softly, not asking questions, not demanding responses, just speaking as if continuing a conversation that had never truly stopped. William could not hear every word from the hallway, but he saw Emily's reaction, a small shift in her breathing, a tightening in her fingers, and then something even more unexpected. Emily reached out, not fully, not confidently, just enough to touch the edge of Grace's sleeve. William felt his chest tighten. That simple movement carried more weight than anything he had seen in months. Grace did not react with surprise. She simply placed her hand gently over Emily's, steady and calm, as if this moment had been expected long before it ever happened. Inside the room, Emily's voice broke the silence again, barely audible, fragile, but real. William froze. It was not a full sentence, not even a complete thought, just a single word that seemed to carry everything she could not express. Grace nodded slowly, her eyes softening in a way William had never seen from anyone in his house. There was something in her expression that felt heavier than compassion. It felt like memory, like she was not just responding to Emily, but remembering her. Later that afternoon, William tried to understand what he had witnessed, not through systems, not through cameras, but through presence. He remained outside Emily's door longer than usual, listening, observing, trying to find logic in what felt increasingly like emotional reality. Inside, Grace was reading aloud. A simple story. No dramatic tone. No performance. Just steady words filling the space where silence had lived for too long. And Emily was listening. Not passively. Actively. As if every sentence mattered. William noticed something else. Emily did not react to authority. Not to doctors. Not to him. But she responded to Grace in ways that bypassed everything he had ever tried. That realization carried an uncomfortable weight, because it suggested connection, not instruction. Trust, not treatment. And trust, in his experience, was always something that could be misplaced. That evening, William reviewed a forgotten set of home recordings from years earlier, back when Emily still spoke freely. What he found unsettled him more than anything before. In those early clips, before the silence began, Emily had once mentioned a woman who knew how to listen without asking. The footage had been dismissed at the time as childhood imagination, nothing more. But now, watching Grace and Emily together through a different lens, William could no longer ignore the resemblance in behavior, in comfort, in recognition. The more he tried to separate past from present, the more they seemed to overlap. And beneath it all, one quiet question began to form in William's mind, growing heavier with every moment he spent watching them together. If Grace had never truly left Emily's side in all the ways that mattered, then what exactly had happened the night Emily stopped speaking in the first place? Something changed in the Carter mansion that morning, and William Carter felt it before he understood it. It was not loud. It was not obvious. It was the absence of tension in the air he had grown used to. For the first time in months, the house did not feel like it was holding its breath. He noticed it when he passed Emily's room. There was no silence pressing against the walls in the same way as before. Instead, there were faint sounds. Not full speech. Not laughter. But something softer. Something alive. William stopped outside the door without entering. Inside, Grace Williams was speaking in the same calm tone she always used, but now there was a rhythm to it that felt different. Not instruction. Not caregiving. Conversation. And then he heard it. Emily's voice. Again. Not clearly. Not fully formed. But stronger than before. A broken sentence, followed by hesitation, then another attempt. William's hand tightened against the wall. He did not move. He could not. Because hearing her voice again felt less like relief and more like stepping into something he still did not understand. Later that day, something happened that William could not ignore. Emily walked out of her room on her own. Slowly, carefully, but without assistance. She stopped at the doorway, as if the hallway itself was unfamiliar territory. Grace followed a few steps behind, not pushing, not guiding, just present. Emily looked toward William for a brief moment. It was the first time she had done that in a long time. Her eyes did not show fear. They did not show avoidance either. They showed uncertainty, like she was trying to decide whether he belonged in the same world she was beginning to step back into. William spoke her name softly. Emily did not respond, but she did not retreat either. That alone felt like progress. Grace placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, and instead of flinching, Emily leaned slightly into the contact. It was a small movement, but it carried more meaning than anything William had seen in years. Something was changing. Not fully healed, not understood, but changing. That afternoon, Dr. Ethan Moore arrived for another evaluation. He studied Emily carefully, asking questions, observing reactions. He noted improvements in engagement, eye contact, and vocal attempts. But what he seemed most focused on was not Emily. It was the consistency of her responses when Grace was present. After the evaluation, he spoke privately with William. He did not offer certainty. He offered possibility. He said that in rare cases, emotional recovery does not follow therapy protocols. It follows trust patterns. And trust, once established, can unlock behaviors that traditional methods fail to reach. William listened, but something in him remained unsettled. Because trust explained improvement, it did not explain timing. That evening, William returned to Emily's room alone. For the first time, he did not rely on cameras or reports. He simply stood at the doorway and watched. Emily was sitting on the floor, drawing. Grace was beside her, not correcting, not directing, just quietly observing. Emily looked up suddenly and said something, this time clearer, still fragile, but recognizable. A question. She was asking about a memory. William felt his breath catch, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. Emily was not just responding. She was remembering, and whatever was unlocking inside her had roots deeper than the present moment. Grace noticed William standing there. She did not react with surprise. Instead, she simply lowered her gaze, as if acknowledging something unspoken. William realized then that the distance between what he knew and what was happening inside his own home was still far greater than he had accepted. And for the first time, a different fear began to form. Not that Emily was not healing, but that she was healing towards something he had never been part of and might never fully understand. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from Emily Carter. It came from silence. Not the peaceful kind that had begun to form in recent days, but something heavier, sharper, as if the house itself had taken a breath and decided to hold it again. William Carter felt it the moment he stepped into the East Wing. Emily was no longer in her room. Grace Williams was not in the kitchen, and the familiar rhythm that had slowly started to rebuild itself was gone. William moved quickly this time, not thinking, only reacting. He checked every room on the lower floor first, then the stairwell leading toward the restricted section of the mansion. That area had been sealed for years, untouched since his wife's passing, a place he rarely entered because memory itself felt heavier there than any physical object. The door was slightly open. That alone was enough to make him stop. Inside, the air felt different, colder, almost untouched by time. And then he heard it, a sound he did not expect. Emily's voice again. But this time it was not fragile. It was steady, engaged, speaking in complete phrases, as if she was remembering something she had not been able to access before. William stepped forward slowly, every instinct warning him not to interrupt what he did not understand. Grace was sitting on the floor with Emily, not leading, not instructing, simply present. Between them were scattered objects William had never seen moved from storage. Old photographs, small personal items from a life he thought had been closed off completely. Emily was holding one of them. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she did not let go. When William entered fully, both of them noticed him immediately. Emily froze, not in fear this time, but in recognition of interruption. Grace stood slowly, her expression controlled but firm. William's voice came out quieter than he intended. He asked what was happening, not as an order, as a question he was not prepared for the answer to. Grace hesitated. For the first time, she did not respond immediately. Emily looked between them, her breathing uneven, as if she was holding on to something fragile that could disappear if the moment broke. Then she spoke. A full sentence, directed at Grace, not at him. William felt something shift inside his chest that he could not name. It was not anger. It was absence. The absence of being included in something that clearly mattered. Grace finally spoke, her tone steady but careful. She explained that Emily had begun recalling fragmented memories tied to this part of the house, memories that had been suppressed by emotional shock. She said that forcing structure or external interpretation was not helping, that Emily needed space to connect the fragments herself. William listened, but the words did not fully settle, because what he was hearing sounded less like explanation and more like permission for something he had not approved. Emily suddenly stood up. Slowly, deliberately, she walked toward one of the old windows and placed her hand on the glass. She whispered something again. This time William heard it clearly enough to understand the weight of it. A name, not his. Grace did not correct her. She simply remained close. That was the moment William made a decision. He said Emily would not be taken into that wing again without supervision. His voice was calm, but firm enough to change the air in the room. Grace did not argue immediately, but Emily reacted before anyone else could speak. She stepped closer to Grace, not to him. William felt it like a physical impact. The alignment in the room had shifted in a way he could no longer ignore. Grace finally responded, carefully stating that restricting access could interrupt progress, that the emotional breakthrough Emily was experiencing was delicate. William answered that he would not risk his daughter's safety for uncertainty. The words were final, but even as he said them, he saw Emily's reaction. Not fear, withdrawal, a quiet retreat back into herself, as if something inside her had just been closed again. Grace looked down, and for the first time, William saw something behind her composure. Concern, not for him, for Emily. And as the room fell silent again, William realized the decision he had just made might not be protecting his daughter at all, but possibly pulling her back into the very place she had only just begun to escape. The collapse did not happen loudly. It happened in silence so deep that William Carter felt it before he even understood it. It began with Emily refusing to leave her room the next morning. Not with fear, not with confusion, but with a quiet withdrawal that felt final in a way William had not seen since the worst days after her mother's death. Grace Williams was already there when William arrived, standing just outside the door, her posture controlled but tense. She did not block him. She simply did not move aside either. That alone told him something had already gone wrong. Emily was inside, sitting on the floor, knees pulled in tightly, her gaze fixed on nothing. The energy that had begun to return over the past days was gone again, as if someone had pulled it out of her without touching her. William stepped forward, asking what had happened. His voice was sharp this time, not because he was angry, but because fear had replaced patience. Grace answered carefully, saying that Emily had become overwhelmed after the interruption the day before. That emotional regression can occur when a fragile sense of safety is broken too suddenly. William heard the explanation, but it did not soften what he saw. Emily did not look at either of them. She did not respond when Grace spoke her name. She simply remained still, as if retreating back into a place no one could reach. That evening, Dr. Ethan Moore arrived earlier than scheduled. He did not speak much at first. He observed Emily for several minutes before asking William and Grace to step outside. When he finally spoke, his tone was more serious than before. He said that Emily's progress had entered a critical stage, that sudden reversals were not uncommon in trauma recovery, but they were dangerous if emotional anchors were disrupted. William immediately understood the implication, even before Grace responded. The doctor was referring to her. William insisted that boundaries needed to remain in place, that structure and oversight were necessary to prevent further confusion. Grace, for the first time, directly disagreed. Not loudly, not emotionally, but firmly. She said that removing emotional consistency at this stage would not restore control. It would erase trust. The word hung in the air between them. Trust. William realized they were no longer discussing treatment. They were discussing influence. That night, William made another decision. He instructed security to restrict access to the East Wing entirely, including unsupervised contact. The order was carried out immediately. When Grace attempted to enter later that night, she was stopped at the corridor entrance. William watched from a distance as she did not argue. She simply stood still for a moment, looking toward Emily's door, before turning away. What William did not see immediately was Emily inside the room, pressing her hands against the door from the other side. The next morning, Emily refused to speak at all, not even when William entered, not even when Grace was nearby under supervision. The silence returned, heavier than before, and this time it felt permanent. Dr. Moore warned William privately that this level of regression could undo months of progress. But what he did not say out loud was more alarming. He said the pattern now resembled a child who had lost her primary emotional anchor. William stood alone afterward in the hallway, listening to the silence behind Emily's door, realizing that in trying to control the situation, he may have removed the only thing that had ever brought his daughter back toward him. And for the first time, he was no longer sure whether he had protected her or pushed her away completely. William Carter knew something had shifted the moment he walked into the mansion that morning. It was not visible at first. The house looked the same, perfectly arranged, perfectly quiet. But the silence was no longer empty. It felt sealed, as if something inside it had been locked away deliberately. Emily had not left her room since the previous night. Grace Williams had not been allowed inside. And for the first time, William could feel the consequences of that decision pressing against every wall of the house. When he approached Emily's door, he hesitated. Not because he feared noise or rejection, but because he feared what silence now meant. He pushed the door open slowly. Emily was sitting in the same position as before, unmoving, her face turned slightly toward the window, but not really seeing anything. The progress they had fought to rebuild felt erased. Behind him, Grace stood at a distance, not entering, respecting the restriction William had imposed. But something about her presence felt different today. Less active, more resigned. Dr. Ethan Moore arrived shortly after. He did not begin with questions this time. He observed Emily for a long time before speaking. Then he said something that made the air in the room change. He said that emotional regression alone did not explain the pattern anymore. There were inconsistencies, gaps in timing, behavioral shifts that did not align with standard trauma recovery models. William immediately asked what that meant. The doctor hesitated, then said there were signs that Emily's responses might not only be tied to emotional safety, but to something more specific, something localized, something connected to memory anchoring within the home itself. Grace's expression changed subtly when she heard this, but she said nothing. William demanded clarification. Dr. Moore explained that in rare cases, children exposed to prolonged emotional shock can form associative memory triggers tied to specific environments, objects, or even individuals. If those anchors are removed or restricted, the emotional structure can destabilize rapidly. William felt a cold realization forming before the doctor even finished speaking. That night, William returned to the East Wing alone. He did not inform security. He did not notify staff. He moved through the corridor that had once been restricted and now stood half reopened after internal review. Something had been restored without his direct approval. Inside the room, he found Grace standing quietly near the old storage cabinet. She did not look surprised to see him. She simply waited. On the table in front of her were items William did not recognize at first. Old photographs, handwritten notes, a worn fabric object that seemed deeply personal. And then he saw it. A file folder, partially open. His name was on it. Not in a professional context. In a personal one. William stepped closer, his voice low, asking what this was. Grace finally spoke. Her voice was steady, but heavier than before. She said these were not new discoveries. They were pieces of a history that had never been fully acknowledged. William opened the folder. Inside were records, dates, and references to events he had either forgotten or never been told in full. And at the center of it all, repeated in different forms, was one consistent pattern. Emily had shown signs of attachment and recognition toward Grace long before the recent behavioral changes ever began. Long before William ever noticed. The implication struck him harder than he expected. He turned toward Grace, asking her why she never mentioned this before. Grace looked at him directly for the first time without hesitation. She said she had tried, in ways that were not understood at the time. She said there were moments when Emily had reached for her, moments that were dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. William felt something inside him tighten, not because of what she said, but because of what he had chosen not to see. And then Grace added something that changed everything. She said Emily's connection was not forming now. It had been interrupted, not by accident, but by decisions made inside this house long before William began paying attention. The words hung in the room without explanation. And for the first time, William did not ask for proof. He asked himself a question he had avoided for years. How much of his daughter's silence had been shaped not by illness, but by what had been taken away from her before he ever understood she needed it? William Carter did not move for a long time after reading the final pages of the file. The mansion around him felt quieter than it had ever been, but it was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence of realization. Every piece of information he had uncovered in the past hours no longer felt like isolated anomalies. They were forming a pattern he had refused to see. Emily's earliest behavioral records. Grace Williams's presence in the house long before formal documentation reflected it. And the repeated references to emotional triggers that predated William's awareness of his daughters. Withdrawal. Everything pointed toward a single conclusion he had avoided naming. Emily's connection to Grace was not new. It was buried, and something inside his own household had severed it. William called Dr. Ethan Moore back immediately, his voice sharper now, demanding full chronological clarity. The doctor arrived within the hour, carrying printed behavioral summaries and early case notes that had never been fully discussed in prior evaluations. As he laid them out, he spoke carefully, almost reluctantly. He confirmed that Emily's earliest periods of stability, months before her silence, consistently aligned with Grace's direct involvement in her daily care. Not structured therapy, not medical intervention. Simple, consistent presence. Emotional anchoring that had never been formally documented because it had never been treated as clinical. William listened without interruption, but something inside him began to fracture under the weight of timing. If Grace had been central to Emily's emotional stability before, then her absence had never been natural. It had been disrupted. William turned toward Grace, who had remained silent through most of the discussion. He asked her directly, for the first time without defensiveness, what she believed had caused the break. Grace hesitated longer than before. Then she said something that changed the atmosphere completely. She said there had been a period when she was removed from Emily's care without explanation that aligned with a restructuring decision inside the household following the loss of William's wife. She did not accuse. She did not speculate beyond what she knew. But the implication was unavoidable. The timeline did not match medical interpretation. It matched internal decisions made by the household itself. William felt the room tighten around him, not with hostility, but with recognition. Because for the first time, The possibility was no longer abstract. It was procedural. Something had been changed in Emily's environment that directly interrupted her emotional continuity. That evening, William requested full archival access to all household personnel records from the months following his wife's passing. What he found confirmed what he had feared but not yet accepted. There had been administrative restructuring. Care responsibilities had been reassigned, and Grace Williams had been formally removed from direct contact with Emily under a directive he had signed during a period he barely remembered processing. The signature was his. The authorization was his. But the consequences had never been presented to him in emotional terms, only operational ones. Emily's decline had not been recorded as loss of connection. It had been recorded as adjustment. Now, sitting alone in the study, William finally understood the gap he had been searching through for months. Nothing had started recently. Everything had been interrupted long ago. The silence in Emily had not appeared. It had been constructed. And Grace, standing silently in the hallway outside, knew what he now understood. The final decision was no longer about investigation. It was about what could possibly be repaired after years of unintentional absence. And for the first time, William was no longer asking what was happening to his daughter. He was asking whether he still had the right to be part of what came next. William Carter stood in the center of the study long after everyone had left the room, as if the weight of everything he had learned needed space to settle into reality. For years, he believed he had been fighting for his daughter by controlling everything around her. But now, control felt like the very thing that had taken her away from him. The truth was no longer fragmented. It was complete, and it was heavier than anything he had ever built in his life. He called Emily's name before he even reached her door, not as an order, not as a question, but as something closer to a plea. When he entered, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, no longer withdrawn in the same way she had been for months. She looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no distance in her eyes, only awareness. Grace Williams stood quietly near the window, not stepping forward, not interrupting, simply present. William realized then that everything he thought had been about recovery had actually been about reconnection. And that connection had always existed, long before he understood it. Emily's voice was soft when she spoke. Not fragile anymore. Not broken. She said Grace had always been the one who stayed when she was afraid. The one who did not ask her to be different. The one who remembered things even when everyone else stopped noticing them. William felt his throat tighten because he finally understood what he had missed. Healing had not been introduced into his daughter's life. It had been interrupted, and then slowly, carefully, restored. He turned to Grace, and for the first time, there was no authority in his voice. Only recognition. He said he now understood what she had been trying to preserve. Grace responded quietly, saying she had never tried to replace anyone. She had only tried to remain present when presence was what Emily needed most. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was full. William stepped closer to Emily, not rushing, not forcing, just lowering himself to her level the way Grace always had. He apologized, not with explanation, but with understanding. He told her he had been trying to protect her in ways that had removed what she needed most. Emily listened. And then, slowly, she reached for his hand. Not with hesitation this time, but with intention. That small movement broke something inside William more completely than any realization before it. Grace stepped back slightly, giving space that did not feel like distance, but completion. Over the next days, the mansion began to change in ways that had nothing to do with systems or structure. The East Wing was no longer restricted. But more importantly, it was no longer isolated. Emily began to move through the house differently, not as someone recovering from silence, but as someone reclaiming her place within it. She spoke more. Not constantly, not easily, but truthfully. And William listened differently than he ever had before. Grace was no longer positioned as staff in the background of the household. She was recognized for what she had always been in Emily's life. A constant presence when everything else had become uncertain. One evening, Emily sat between them in the living room. Her voice steady as she told a memory neither of them had heard in full before. It was not dramatic. It was simple, but it explained everything they had spent months trying to understand. William realized that what he had once mistaken for silence had actually been a language he never learned to hear. That night, the house was quiet again, but it was not empty. Emily fell asleep without fear. Grace remained nearby, no longer as someone hidden in the margins, but as someone whose place had finally been acknowledged. And William sat alone for a long time, not thinking about what he had built in the world outside, but about what he had nearly lost inside his own home. For the first time, he understood clearly that wealth had never been the missing piece. Presence had been. And as he looked toward his daughter sleeping peacefully for the first time in years, he finally accepted a truth that no amount of success had ever taught him. A family cannot be repaired through control. It can only be restored through love that is patient enough to stay when everything else has fallen away.